In the last 6 years, many of the assumptions with regards to political economy, with regards to social policy, public policy, with regards to how politics deals with people's everyday problems have been smashed. The political economy of neoliberalism, broadly ascendant since the mid-1970s, no longer has the consensus that it once did. People's living standards across the board in the United Kingdom are in decline. What have the last 6 years meant for the Green Party?
Well, I think, first of all, if you look at the Green Party over the past 6 years, the big event for us was, of course, the election of Caroline Lucas as our first MP in 2010. That made us a parliamentary party. It gave us the opportunity to put bills before Parliament. I mean, Caroline at the moment has one that would bring the railways back into public hand. It's given us more profile, more opportunity to do things. So that's a huge aspect of the past 6 years. We've also seen the membership of the Green Party double in that time, which is, of course, quite exciting. If you look at the broader framework of these things, the state of politics, I think we've seen, you can divide it into two periods. 2007 to 2010, people were obviously shocked by the economic crisis, by the banking crash, but they were also, there was a feeling in that period that, oh well, we always knew that the end of boom and bust was a fiction, really, but this is just one of those crises of capitalism that we know happen, and things will move on much as they were before. But I think we're at the point now, sort of gradually developing over the past 3 years, is a real sense that, no, we're at a real turning point. Neoliberalism, privatisation, globalisation has actually really hit the buffers. This is a system, a way of thinking about the world, a way of acting that is run out of steam, that is now actively dangerous, and we have to change. What's really lacking at the moment, I think, is a sense of how, what the new world, what the new possibilities look like. What does a prosperous future in which our children and grandchildren, the coming generations, have a better life than we have? At the moment, we need to do a huge amount of work of painting that picture.
So, I think I broadly agree with you that the prevailing sense within civil society is that austerity is not working, privatisation is not working, neoliberalism is not working. And even when you look at some of the opinion polls in the run-up to the last general election, there was actually majority support for austerity, and that's probably because people didn't really know quite what it meant, but also because it tended to just mean cuts to public spending. But as we know, there's a broader understanding of austerity, which means wage repression. It means recapitalising banks, recatalyzing profits for finance capitalism at the expense of everybody else. So austerity has a broader understanding of that, but there was consensus for that project of cuts to public services. That seems to have gone, and I agree with you that I think that sense has changed. In spite of that, however, the political party or project that has the most momentum coming out of 2010 seems to have been UKIP, because they had a fantastic result in 2009, disappointing in the last general election, and now they're on a real upturn, not just at the European level, where they might be seen as a protest vote, but in by-elections and in council elections last year, they did staggeringly well. Why do you think UKIP have benefited so much from a crisis where many of the solutions they propose are broadly an extension of an ideology that's been discredited?
Well, I think if this means very good demographic work on the people who vote UKIP, and they're very much people from lower incomes, lower education levels, older people who feel like the world has changed and they really don't understand where things are. And UKIP paints a picture of going back to some, past golden age, non-existent golden age. Then somehow or other, doing a couple of magic things like stopping immigration and even leaving the EU will magically transform. And that's an attractive vision to some people. I think, however, it's a little early to tell, but I think we're actually seeing a point. I mean, despite the fact that UKIP finished second in a couple of parliamentary by-elections, it's also become very clear that it's going to be extraordinarily hard for them to win a seat in 2015. They may or may not do as well in the European elections. It's interesting because actually the polls have come off in the past few months, and UKIP has been exposed a little bit like, I wouldn't necessarily compare them politically, but if you look at what happened to the BNP when they had the light of day shone on them, the light of publicity shone on them, they fell apart quite quickly. And UKIP have had a lot of scandals, a lot of things that have made people who might have voted UKIP sort of lean back and go, oh, perhaps not. So I think it's actually very hard to see where UKIP goes. I would compare it to a hot air balloon. It appears on the horizon, gets very big, blocks the view briefly, but then one way or another disappears quite quickly.
So if you look at, for instance, some of those by-election results in the north, Labour are winning, but on dramatically reduced turnout. So you're getting sort of 30% now. It's a regular occurrence for by-elections, and the local elections were pretty close to that last year. dramatically reduced turnout, UKIP are coming second. So even though Labour might be trouncing them, it's clear that, as happened with Scotland, after the early 1980s, the Conservatives are no longer a force north of the border. We know that. That seems to be being repeated in many parts of northern England, major cities in the United Kingdom. And there's that space for a second party. So even if UKIP are found out exposed, they could still credibly be that second party, couldn't they? Because the Liberal Democrats certainly aren't going to do it anytime soon.
Well, no, I don't think so, because, I mean, the fact is, UKIP aren't a parliamentary party now. They don't have... They obviously have people in Brussels, but they have no one in Westminster. And it's going to be extraordinarily hard for them to win a seat, to win in the first past the post electoral system. 20% is not going to do you any good if you get 20% around the country and you won't get a single MP. I mean, the Green Party found this in 1989 when we got 15% of the vote around the whole country in a European election. And because it was then first past the post in European elections too, we didn't get a single MEP. So, with the current electoral system, UKIP has some pretty serious barriers there, and they also have some pretty serious institutional structures. And they also, simply don't present a very coherent picture of what they'd actually like to do. I mean, Mr Farage has apparently declared his entire 2010 manifesto as nonsense. And that kind of thing, doesn't play very well in the longer term, I don't think.
So what makes the Green Party different? Because you're saying that first past the post doesn't suit newcomers, it favours incumbents, it means there's high cost of entry if you want to enter Westminster. The same applies to the Green Party, no?
Well, no, because we've shown that when we have overcome that. I mean, the Green Party's been around for 40 years. It's taken us a long time, to build up to get that first Westminster seat. But we showed the discipline, the organisation, and, we had the track record in Brighton and Hove as having had a large number of councillors there for some time. So we actually have done the build-up, have done the hard work, where a party that has very strong democratic structures, our policies are made by our members. It's not a case of, the leader suddenly deciding that I'm going to write off all of our old policies and have a new lot. We have a whole democratically developed policy system. We have councillors up and down the country who are really solid people delivering good work on the ground. In Norwich, for example, we've been the opposition on the council there for quite some time. And so, in Solihull, we're likely to be in that position. We've been building up gradually, doing the hard work on the ground, being the people who are there for local communities. So we have that track record, and that makes us very different to UKIP.
There was a poll taken last year in November by CLAS, the Centre for Labour and Social Studies, and it revealed some staggering opinions on the role that the state should play, not just with regards to the cost of energy, transport, but rent and even groceries. That led to a piece on City AM referring to a growing, exploding taste for nationalisation and a certain kind of socialism. That was written by the editor Alistair Heath. Many of those polls indicate public preference for policies that aren't just left of the governing consensus, aren't just left of the coalition government, aren't just left of the Labour Party. They're left of any mainstream political party since the early 1980s. That would indicate a preference for some of the policies that the Green Party championed at the last general election. A living wage, a citizen's pension, massive investment into transport, energy infrastructure and so on. So why hasn't the public moved to the Greens, or is that happening?
Well, I think we're seeing it happening. We actually, it's interesting in terms of, you look at the council elections last year. We got our first Green councillors in Cornwall, Essex, Surrey, Kent, and several places in the West Midlands. And if you think about that as sort of, a spread around the country, think of a map, that very much represents a spreading out, our party becoming much more national, certainly across England. And so we're very much growing. More and more people have a Green local council representative. And if we look at the European elections this year, it would only take a swing of 1.6% to actually see us treble our number of MEPs. And that would mean 6 MEPs around the country. And many more people would actually have both a local councillor and a local MEP. And so that makes Green much more part of the local political landscape. So we're growing into that space, we're becoming much more national, we're becoming much bigger, we have more members, our membership is on a very steady growth pattern. So all of those things are moving forward, and that will put us in a good position to go into 2015.
There's been a big discussion about participatory forms of politics, and a lot of the social movements that we've seen post-crisis, particularly in 2011, had a real emphasis on consensus, respect, mutual recognition, and the horizontalist movement, so to speak, have had a real critique of hierarchical forms of organisation. How does that fit into something like the Green Party? Because clearly there is a tension with any organisation that seeks to embody horizontalist values, but also is trying to achieve certain objectives, because means can't always be ends. So is there a bit of a tension there? And do you find with some of the newer members who may think of themselves as horizontalists or influenced by that kind of politics, do they find themselves at times in a bit of difficulty in an organisation like the Green Party? Or do you think these kinds of mechanisms, as the one you just mentioned, do you think they do the job?
Yeah, no, I think very much that, the kind of philosophy was behind UK Uncut, that was behind Occupy, those kind of decision-making procedures, they sit very, very comfortably. That's what the Green Party has actually been doing for decades. I mean, we have some procedures that we mightn't necessarily follow, but in the past there used to be the speaking stick, and that was how you decided who was speaking, and everyone got their turn, and we don't necessarily do things like that anymore. But that whole ethos of giving everyone a chance to speak, everyone being listened to respectfully, and then trying to achieve consensus, or at least really have had a chance to everyone have their say, is very much absolutely integral to both our kind of constitutional structures, but also probably more importantly our kind of what you might call our political DNA. That's what being green means, is having those kind of structures. And we do have quite a lot of the jazz hands from Occupy. You'll also see at quite a few Green Party meetings.
If you look at the lay of the land politically in the run-up to the 2015 general election, it increasingly seems as if it's going to be characterised by a cost of living crisis, discussions about a cost of living crisis. That's even the case, it seems, within the Conservative Party. You've got a number of backbenchers trying to influence the Chancellor with regards to increasing the minimum wage to what it would have been had it maintained parity with inflation over the last several years. Within that narrative of a cost of living crisis, where does the Green Party fit? Because it seems to me that for some, discussing a cost of living crisis with regards to a first world country is at odds with a sustainable idea of a future economy. So if you're talking about a cost of living crisis, how the poor, for instance, can ensure that they have sufficient heating, if you can talk about increasing aggregate demand or consumption for low-income earners, that doesn't necessarily reside particularly well with green economics.
Oh, I wouldn't agree with that at all. I mean, a foundation of green economics is that social and environmental justice go together. And what I say is what we're trying to achieve is a situation where everyone's society has enough for a decent quality of life, the access to the resources for a decent quality of life. And if you take, for example, one Green Party policy that's been there ever since the start, which is basic income or citizens' income, which is a very foundational idea relating to that. But I think cost of living crisis is a very narrow way of looking at our current problems. We have a whole system that isn't working, that isn't delivering for people anymore. And if we think, for example, one of the obvious ones is energy bills. Now, we've got various, other parties making promises on, cutting so-called green levies, which means they're actually cutting the rate of houses are being insulated for the Tory party. You've got Labour who are saying, we're going to have this price freeze for a fixed period of time. But what we say is, first of all, what we have to do is look at energy consumption. We need warm, comfortable homes that are affordable to heat, and that means an entire change in the quality of our housing. And so we back through the program that's called the Energy Bill Revolution, which suggests the idea of taking the money from carbon taxes that the government gets and putting it into do energy efficiency, insulation and other things in every home that needs it. Now that policy would lift 9 out of 10 people out of fuel poverty, create up to 200,000 jobs, and cut carbon emissions. So that's just one example of the kind of ways in which we actually need to change things. If you look at the broader economy, then you're actually thinking about, we talk about the need to relocalise our economy, bring manufacturing and food production back to Britain, bring all of those jobs and economic opportunities and business opportunities back to Britain, and rebuild strong local economies. So if you build it around local businesses, small businesses and cooperatives, then money goes round and round in a town, creating jobs, creating opportunities. Whereas if we have the big globalised multinational structure, money just swooshes away out of town. If you think about, I talk about a £1 bag of apples. You buy that at Tesco or Sainsbury's, and what you have is maybe there's one minimum wage worker serving 6 self-service tills. The amount of money from that £1 bag of apples that stays in your local community is tiny. If you go and buy it from a local greengrocer, and she uses a local accountant to do her tax. When she needs a new sign, she uses a local sign writer. She buys her stationery from the local shop. You can think of all of those ways in which small businesses encourage other small businesses, encourage jobs, get money going round and round in communities. And that's the kind of economic model that we need to move towards. And that, of course, fits very well with our environmental needs as well, because if that apple comes in from South Africa or New Zealand, that's not great for the environment.
So is globalisation a force for good? Because it doesn't sound like you think it is.
No, I think, I'm not talking about autarky or anything like that. I quite like my morning coffee, and I don't mind the odd banana. But what we need to do is the basics of life, our basic staple foods, our clothing, the table, all of those kind of things. We need to make those sort of things much more locally. And globalisation, has just been utterly the wrong direction. It hasn't worked for the developed world, but also we're increasingly recognising the kind of damage that's been done in the developing world.
A lot of people disagree with that because they'd say, I've just bought this washing machine, it's Chinese made, and it's cost me not very much. Likewise for my kid's computer or my husband's, mobile phone. And it's those consumer durables that have been made in the developing world that have meant that in the developed world we've been able to have wage repression for the last several decades because, you've got increasingly cheap consumer durables. So globalisation for a lot of people means nice, or in the developed world, let's say, and that's not the majority of global civil society accepted, but for the kinds of people you're trying to get the vote of, for a lot of people it means nice things at relatively cheap prices, and as long as wages stay low, that's totally understandable. So is it possible that you can offer another kind of globalisation, or are you simply saying that the last 30 years have been a mistake with regards to policy, with regards to economics, with regards to ecology?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what we have to recognise is that those relatively cheap things, that's only what's on the price tag. It's not actually the real cost of these things. I mean, I often talk about, the £5 T-shirt. People say, isn't it wonderful you can buy a £5 T-shirt in this high street shop? But if you think about the actual real cost of that T-shirt, you have perhaps a child in Uzbekistan, 10-year-old, forced into the fields as slave labour to pick the cotton. Then you use fossil fuels to ship it to China, where it's spun into cloth in a factory that spews its dyes straight out into the nearest river, and it has all sorts of negative environmental impacts. You then ship it with fossil fuel again down to Bangladesh, and we all know about Bangladesh garment factories these days. Fossil fuel again back here, sold in a high street store that has people on minimum wage and 0 hours contracts. Now, the real cost of that T-shirt isn't £5. The real cost that we're all bearing is is the cost of that child that didn't get an education, all of those carbon emissions from all the fossil fuel transport, the pollution, the human suffering, the human misery along that chain. There's a huge cost on that £5 T-shirt, and the world simply can't keep bearing those kind of costs.
So do you think the trick then is to explain to the public more generally that that person who's 0 hours contract outsourced worker in the UK within a broader commodity chain or a supply chain that goes all the way back to, like, separately Uzbekistan or Bangladesh, do you think that's the secret then? Because trying to not just have because we know that discourses about ethical consumption don't really work as popular political projects. So would that have to be allied to conversations about declining pay, declining standards of living here in the UK?
I think it has to be allied to the whole issue of costs. So it is all part of the same system, and the same system means that the owner or the private equity companies that own that firm ship the money off to the nearest tax haven, is never to be seen again in Britain. The ownership structures, but also the costs. I mean, in terms of the carbon emissions, we're now seeing after the floods over Christmas, there's a new recognition that, it's not just the case that climate change is a reality, but that it can actually affect us, not just people in distant places, in very different looking places to Britain, but the effect is actually here.
I'm really glad you mentioned the floods because, I remember watching pictures of every major party political leader and Nigel Farage all in their, Nick Clegg was kind of, unique in so much as he wore jeans, but everybody else was wearing, sort of like Barber overalls and their wellies and so on. Probably never seen the outside of a Land Rover in Chelsea, and now they're being put to good use. But I thought, why isn't Will Duckworth, Natalie Bennett, Caroline Lucas, why aren't they in Somerset with their wellies and their overalls? Because, people, it's a very hackneyed comment, but it's so true. Never let a crisis go to waste. And I thought it almost strange that the Green Party was notably absent from that conversation until you said, and this is what I thought was really outstanding, but I was very much surprised, that anybody who was a climate denier shouldn't really participate in public policy making. Do you think those floods, that crisis of the winter, present a real opportunity for the Green Party to make strong public arguments about climate change and effects, real concrete, tangible effects it's going to have here in the UK? Has that perhaps been a political event which could change the conversation quite dramatically?
All right, I think first of all I'll address the wellies question.
Yeah.
What I chose to do instead was I launched our 10-point flood response plan from the Thames barrier, because it's an example of where we've made some very effective measures to deal with flooding that involve significant public investment and really looking to the long term. So rather than joining the Wellington trudge, you might call it, I thought I'd focus on something positive instead, and not lots of people. There was quite a lot of complaints about politicians trailing around who are actually interfering with flood relief efforts, and that's just not the right thing to do, very obviously. But on the broader question in terms of making sure, using this to really say, look, climate change is here, it's now a reality. The IPCC report came out last year, and any kind of scientific debate about the reality of climate change is over. Obviously, it's really driven this home to people, and there's a very telling YouGov poll that came out, and they ask it every week. They ask people what the 3 most important issues to them are. And environment jumped in 1 week from 9% to 23%. Now that's practically unprecedented, and certainly demonstrates that people really have caught on to the fact that climate change is very here, now, visible.
Your party's committed to a guaranteed basic income. For some, that's an incredibly radical policy, and it's been Green Party policy for quite a while. It's gaining increased traction with regards to not just NGOs, but a lot of the mainstream media has been talking about it in the last several years. How radical a measure do you think it is? Because for some it would mean the end of capitalism.
I'm not quite sure. I wouldn't necessarily see it that, but it would certainly see a transformation of basically taking away the fear. I mean, where at the moment we've had an increasingly unequal society. We've gone past 20s levels of inequality, and we're now heading towards Victorian levels of inequality. And that means, if you think about it, the Spirit Level, the excellent book on this subject, if you think about it as a very steep ladder, everyone's desperately clinging on, because they don't want to start to slide down the ladder because there's a long way to fall and it's very, very miserable at the bottom. But what we have instead, the idea of a basic income is it's like a beautiful cushion that's sitting there that no one needs to worry about falling too far, and we can actually, so there's a safety net there. And I think fear is really one of the sort of key drivers and forces and damaging factors in our society at the moment, is people fear sliding down that ladder of inequality, really ending up struggling. The benefit safety net has been ripped to shreds. People are very frightened about this, and the basic income just takes away the fear. And one of the interesting things about it is that people are always, mainstream economists find it really hard to model. It frightens them silly because it would change people's behaviour. And, it might be hard to find people to do really miserable jobs. You might end up with a sewer cleaner being paid more than a banker, and maybe that's fair and reasonable. But, it creates the basis whereby people don't have to take utterly miserable, soul-destroying, horrible situations to work employment just because there's no alternative. And it's very important and really makes potential change. And it's interesting that Switzerland is having a referendum on it. There's been a very big push for an EU. They didn't quite get the numbers, but an EU citizen-initiated debate on it, and that's going to come back again. And so it's very much an idea that's growing.
Across not just the European Union, but more broadly the world, we're seeing declining memberships for political parties. That's the case not just here in the United Kingdom for the Conservatives, where we're seeing a party with a membership plausibly of fewer than 100,000. It was 3 million in the 1950s. Same is true, of course, for Labour to a lesser extent. There's a decline over the long term with regards to party membership there, and of course the Liberal Democrats more recently. However, you go to Germany, SPD, same story. The Partido Popular in Spain, same story. PASOK in Greece, same story. So across the political spectrum and across countries, we're seeing a decline in memberships of party politics, particularly the young, and they're less likely to join parties than their grandparents were. That's not necessarily based on political apathy, because I think people are as political as ever, but increasingly it seems that people don't seem to situate political parties within their own practice in terms of better politics or seeking social justice. So how important is joining a party, or specifically the Green Party, for someone who broadly thinks they are aligned with your political project? Or can they just buy their ethical bananas and coffee?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, political actions come in a wide range of formats. If you organise a litter pick in your local community to make your community better, that's a political action. But ultimately, where the decisions are made is in your local council, in Westminster, in Brussels. That's where the decisions are made. And what I think we've seen over the past decade or so is particularly NGOs have adopted a lobbying model. They've said, oh, well, we can't get too close to the Green Party, we can't get too big P political because we've got to lobby our local Labour council and lobby the Tory government, etc., etc. But actually, I think very clearly that lobbying model has failed. I think I only have to say one phrase, the greenest government ever, which is now a very sad, sick joke. And that was the product of lobbying the kind of people who were Tory and Lib Dem politicians, and people saying, oh, we'll just lobby them because they're the people in power. But what we actually have to do is put people like us, people who think like us, in power, because that's where the decisions are made. That's the only way things are going to get changed. Now, I regard the Green Party as the political wing of what I call the small g Green movement. And that means everything from UK Uncut and Occupy to Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, right through to the RSPB and the Campaign for the Protection of Rural England. Across that broad spectrum, we need to actually elect people with those views, with those ideas, with those backgrounds, to be the people making the decisions. It's not good enough anymore for us to just be lobbying the political class.
That's a really interesting point, because I think a lot of the social movements of the 1980s, they were very dynamic. The Green movement, particularly in Germany, was one of those movements, but we see them squatting movements, for instance, Germany, the Netherlands, to a lesser extent here, but of course also still here. Anti-nuclear movement, of course, as well. A lot of those movements, their energies got tied up, like you say, I think, in the third sector and lobbying. And that seems to have historically failed. And so you're saying that historical failure should lead to a return to big P politics for people that are seeking social justice, because clearly lobbying political incumbents who, big P, politically are different to the Green Party, is insufficient. Is that what you're saying, basically?
Exactly that, right. What you get is you get greenwash, you get David Cameron hugging a husky, you get all of those, you get little sops, policy sops, you get gestures, but you don't get real change.
So I think two of the most important debates in Britain today with regards to politics, not between people like you and I, but over breakfast tables and pubs, is the north-south divide and the difference and the unique role, actually, of London in the national economy. But the relationship of that north-south divide to discussions over migration. Because if you look at, for instance, the performance of UKIP here in London, it's atrocious. And you've got, I think, a wholly different view of migration when you compare it to attitudes. For instance, I'm from, for instance, Bournemouth and Dorset. Very different, albeit it's a very affluent part of the country, a GDP of $50,000 per head. There seems to be a notable difference with regards to ideas on migration. So do you think that because of the kind of economic model we've got and the role that London plays in that rentier capitalism, the city, finance capitalism, do you think that it makes it incredibly easy for politicians to dress up to that unemployed plumber in Stoke, right? Because, these people don't really know what wealth even looks like. It's very easy to blame that local imam or the new mosque down the road because they don't know, Bishop's Avenue here in London, right? They don't really know what it looks like. So do you think there's a connection between the north-south divide and views on migration, which are increasingly pernicious outside of the capital?
I think it's the whole issue is utterly insufficiently debated in terms of regional development policy, and which very much is the underlying cause behind the north-south divide. We've had policies focusing on the interests of the bankers. That means the interests of London, and even more narrowly, the interests of the square mile, the city of London. And one of Green Party policies that I find is most popular, sometimes you have to explain it, but once you've explained it, is we want to abolish the Corporation of the City of London. Which would, wouldn't solve all the problems, but would really help to reduce the influence of the bankers. But in terms of, regional development policy, you look at the HS2, high-speed 2 rail proposal. Now, it would, on their own figures, the consortium's own figures, 72% of the journeys would be into London. You think about sucking money, sucking people, sucking resources, and, turning parts of Birmingham into commuter suburbs of London for the wealthiest. All of those things, we've just got a whole direction of travel that's focusing everything on London and the southeast. In recent figures, 7 out of 10 new jobs being created in the country are in London. So we have that huge imbalance problem, and I think you're right, because people feel like particularly in London and the southeast, it feels crowded. And it is quite crowded, but that's not because of immigration. It's because that's where everybody's coming, because that's where the opportunities are. And so we need to spread out, create opportunities for all of those northern and Midlands towns and cities to have those strong local economies I was talking about earlier, to have money going round and round in those economies, to have jobs, to have opportunities, so people can stay, near their families. Because most people would like to live somewhere near their families, maybe not too close sometimes, but, near their families. People aren't moving around always because they want to, they're doing it because they have to.
You said that you are opposed to a certain kind of globalisation, but it seems to me that that kind of globalisation, one of the advantages of it, has been a huge change in terms of migratory patterns across the world. In the last 30 years, you've seen a transformation in the kind of population here in London, but places like Spain and Italy is seeing dramatic changes in demographics. The United States as well. So to what extent, if you think that's a discredited global model of political economy, how can you ally that to a quite cosmopolitan understanding of citizenship? Because if you're saying local jobs for local people...
I wouldn't put it that way. What I would say is that many of those people who move have been absolutely forced to move by globalisation. You think about a classic one, a young Filipino mother of a couple of children who goes to Hong Kong to work as a maid, sees those children once a year because she's making the money she can there to give them a chance for an education. Now, that's not a good thing, and it's not something that people would choose. Many of the people who've been moving, we think of, the extreme examples like Chinese cockle pickers. There's lots of people for whom the story ends tragically badly. There's lots of people for whom immigration is a thoroughly miserable thing, and they've been forced into it. We think about the horrors of the boats crossing the Mediterranean and the horrendous death toll there. That, I don't believe anyone could call that a good thing. So what we want to do is create a situation where there are opportunities for people to move, to travel, because they want to, not because they're forced to. And at the moment, a huge amount of that movement is effectively forced. And of course, when we look at climate change, we're looking at potentially much more forced movement. So all of those things, they're not good things. Rickety boats setting out to cross the Med, that is just absolutely dreadful. And that's a product of globalisation.
You talked a second ago about what I think is a great policy, abolition of the Corporation of London. Let's talk about the city briefly and finance. Tax avoidance since 2010, I think, has probably been the issue that's been most highlighted by extra parliamentary politics. And it's just a huge bellwether of where political parties have moved, how political parties have moved since 2010. It's not just an issue for the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, but even David Cameron, I think, chairing the G7 last year, talks about tax avoidance as a global issue, which is really amazing when you think about how agendas can be set by, what was initially a couple of dozen people on a high street in central London. So, tax avoidance. If we're talking about global flows of people, capital and goods, how can it be resolved? Because I know your longer term aim is obviously to structurally aim at all of that, but clearly that's not going to happen in 1, 2, 5 years. That requires a global settlement. So how can the UK independently do anything about tax avoidance?
I've got a very simple solution to this. Caroline Lucas's private member's bill from 2011, Tax and Financial Transparency Bill. I'm not saying it would solve all the problems, but it's got a model in there of what's called country-by-country reporting. So that would insist that any company working in Britain reports every country it works in the world, how many employees it's got, what its profits are, what its turnover are. So you have that simple requirement on any company that's operating in Britain. And what you've done is you've pulled the veil back. If it suddenly appears that, your high street coffee shop mysteriously, ships, well, theoretically, on paperwork, ships all of its coffee through Switzerland, where it employs 3 men and the office dog, and makes 20% of its entire global profits there, that's suddenly very obvious, very open, and you can start to work on that. So that's not a solution, but once we've pulled the veil back, which has happened to a large degree as well, then we've made some progress on this. Create the legal framework that says you have to tell us what you're doing around the globe. You can't operate.
Substantially, that doesn't mean much in terms of enforcing an increased tax take from a lot of these.
No, but what you can actually do is once you pull that veil back, and I think it's interesting. For example, we've seen a certain high street Starbucks has basically there's some figures that show that some of the expose of their tax situation actually helped to, cut their profits. So once you make that more open, and you can say to people, well, look, this company is quite decent, those three are really bad, make a choice there, then you've got a really powerful weapon. And then once you've also exposed the enormous costs, I mean, they talk about £110 billion a year lost to the British economy, to British income, state income. So what you have to do is say, here's what's happening, what are we going to do about it, folks? But pulling the veil back is the starting point.
But it seems to me that, I don't want to focus on it too much, but it seems to me that you're saying that the best that can be hoped for, and it seems a great start, is to expose a lot of these crimes, which I think has increasingly been the case over the last several years in any case, and that the consumer will then make an informed choice, almost an ethical choice, about where they're going to drink their coffee or buy their chocolate or whatever. And that seems a great place to start. But government, in terms of actually getting the tax from these companies, it seems to me at a national level, without cross-European collaboration or G20 or even G71 global collaboration, it doesn't seem possible, does it?
Well, no, I think what I'm saying is very much a start. And as you say, in 2010, when I went out in general election campaigning and said to journalists, we're going to make multinational companies pay their taxes, they reeled back in horror and said, oh, the British people will never vote for that, that's too radical a policy. And once you've also done that exposure, you're not just talking about consumer behaviour, you're also talking about the chance to really shift politics. And we've seen the rhetoric of politics shift. I mean, David Cameron came out and stood on the steps of the G8, I think it was, and said, we're going to crack down on tax evasion. They're not doing it. In fact, they've done the opposite and actually made it easier for tax avoidance. Once you shift the politics, then you can shift the action. So, but exposing it, making it really clear what's happening is the starting point.
So to what extent do you think the Green Party is potentially seen as a part of the working class, and those Labour voters, the people that voted Michael Foot, and they're sometimes characterised because National Union of Mine is 84, 85, but it was a broad section of society. I mean, in 1980 the UK had 12 million trade union members. A lot of them are no longer members of trade unions. Broad swathes of society were tied up with that old socialist project and the Labour Party and the trade union movement. To what extent do you think the Green Party can become their party?
Well, I think what we're finding is if we have around the country in places where we've got strong, where we've grown, people have actually seen what the Green Party is and what it stands for, and whether that's making the minimum wage a living wage, renationalising the railways, opposing the privatisation of the NHS, or opposing student fees. Once people get to know us, they recognise that we are standing up for them, speaking up for them. And of course, most people are more and more aware that the Labour Party certainly isn't. So, I think it's a question of us getting more exposure, people getting more chance to see us, and seeing, that we still, it's very easy for the media, and sometimes it does fall back to some, some very old stereotypes about what the Green Party looks like. And, I'm here before you looking like what I look like, but if you were speaking to Will Duckworth, who's our deputy leader, he comes from Dudley, he's our first councillor in Dudley. And, he looks like what he is, which is, a boy from Dudley who's been there all his life, sounds like that, is like that, comes from, very much a working class kind of background. So, what does the Green Party look like? It looks like Britain.
Final question, brief question. Are you an optimist with regards to not just the Green Party, but the cause of social justice in the UK and Europe and the world over the next 10 years? And if you are an optimist, why?
I'm an optimist, I guess, because my belief in human nature. I've actually just been reading a book talking about human evolution. And if you think about, us as a species 20 or 30,000 years ago, we can't run very fast, we don't have fangs and claws, yet somehow we both survived and incredibly prospered. And we did that by cooperating together. That's how we survived the saber-toothed tiger attack way back historically. Cooperation is an innate part of human nature. Looking out for the weaker, the more vulnerable people in society. That's something that human societies, as far back as we can know about, have always done. And I think, we saw neoliberalism, the rise of a whole right-wing ideology that said, oh, just leave the poor and the weak behind and, it's their own fault. And that was a very brief paroxysm, I believe, in human history. And I think we're going to move back to a situation that says, in David Cameron's terms, we are all in this together. We're on one planet. We need to make sure that everyone has sufficient resources for a decent life within the environmental limits of this planet, because that really is the only way forward.
Natalie Bennett, thank you.